Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon to hear us talk about our research. My name is Steve Lewis. I'm the CV Star Transnational China Fellow here at the Baker Institute. And this is one of a series of programs and events that we're putting on our 20th anniversary of the Baker Institute. This, I've been here for 16 years as part of the Baker Institute, as part of a project we have called the Transnational China Project, which was actually set up in '97 and '98. And it was set up with Richard Smith in history and Benjamin Lee in anthropology. And our goal was to try to understand the ways that Chinese culture and Chinese society is opening up to the outside world, becoming more transnational as time went by. So we're looking at the circulation of people, ideas, commodities, technologies, and capital between China and other parts of the world, and in particular, the other Chinese language parts of the world. Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore is something we've been very, very interested in. And we thought that today would be a good time for us to showcase some of our research on Chinese media. And we brought together 3 scholars who are media scholars, although I'll confess up front that I'm only half a media scholar. And I'll point that out because I'm a political scientist. Those of you who are familiar with my research usually see me up here talking about shale gas or China and BTUs and things like that, and barrels of oil equivalent and stuff like that. But my other hat, actually, is an older hat that I started wearing back in the 1980s. As an undergraduate at Ohio University in St. Louis, I went to the Scripps School of Journalism because I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. It's kind of hard to explain this to the younger generation, but those of you who grew up with All the King's Men and the Nixon White House and everything in the 1970s know that journalists were viewed as being heroic, right, in the 1980s, and this is an honorable profession. Well, okay, that idea has kind of gone by the wayside, but in the 1980s, I very much wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and so after I graduated from Ohio University in '85, I went to China. At that time, there were very, very few foreign correspondents, I think about 12 from Western countries, and they were very tightly controlled. I ended up working for Newsweek, but my main job was actually teaching English at Beijing Normal University. But for one summer, I also interned at, had a job at Xinhua, the Chinese government news agency, where my job was to be a copy polisher, but also to give them advice on how to become more Western in their journalistic practices. And one of the things I can remember from that period was quite interesting was they came to me with a story. And they said, we have a story here about the People's Liberation Army and reform. We've done a survey, and 5,750, something like that, Chinese political liberation army officers support reforms. And they said, do you have, should we go ahead and run this story in here as it's written this way? And I said, well, usually when you do a survey in the Western press, you give percentages, and you talk about how many support and how many don't support. And, oh, no, all Chinese officers support reforms. And I go, okay. I said, but it only says 5,000 here. Surely there are more than 5,000 political, officers in the People's Liberation Army. Does this mean most officers don't support reforms? Oh, okay, that's interesting. And they pulled the story and never ran it, of course, And so it was interesting because at that, there were 4 editors that I was supposedly working for. 3 of them actually had master's degrees in journalism from either Columbia University in New York City or University of Missouri in Columbia. And they were quite well aware of modern journalistic practices, and they were trying to make Xinhua become more Western and more global. All of that kind of changed in 1989 when Xinhua didn't come out fast enough in support of what was viewed as being government policies. But there was a very different media sphere at that time, and that's why I thought I would start off by talking. We have, as I just mentioned, I'm a political scientist, and in just a minute I'll introduce the real media scholars, people who are doing more recent work. But I think it's worthwhile just kind of stepping back for a second to see how far we've come in just the last 20 or 30 years. So as I mentioned, I used to work for the Chinese government news agency, and this was before the internet. Okay, so no internet. Fax machines were just coming into fashion in 1985. Most journalists, including Xinhua, worked on teletype. an actual teletype and a ticker tape in the actual offices. When I taught classes at Beijing Normal University, I said, can I photocopy my classes, my handouts to give my students? Oh, no, that's far too expensive. I said, okay, well, can I type them up and use stencils or carbon paper? Yeah, but there's a problem with that. I said, what's the problem? Well, you're going to have to sign here for that. So I had to get permission of the department secretary and the university to actually buy carbon paper from a store. And what they were worried about, of course, was the samizdat, the Russian style, using carbon paper to write newsletters that can then be passed around. Most political communication at that time was reserved for big character posters that were maybe some writing on a wall. At my university in '87, there were some demonstrations against the government, and students had written big character posters on the wall, and that was the only way, effectively, to actually communicate. So that's just talking about the protest side. The other side, of course, is that there's an awful lot of other forms of political communication going on, and I'll talk about advertising in just a minute. So just in the last 30 years or so, we've seen big changes with the introduction of the internet and digital media. And I thought it'd be useful just to talk about very recently what's actually kind of happened as a way to set up our discussions by my colleagues here. Okay. Well, what's happened recently? Well, the 18th Party Congress. Every 5 years, the Chinese Party Congress, 5,000 some delegates come together. They choose a central committee, which chooses a Politburo, and on up. This happened last November, right? And so they chose the new party leaders. And the outgoing party leaders, most of them who are over 68 years old, that's the cutoff line for coming into a new Politburo. The outgoing leaders have now moved on into retirement. Now we have the next generation. And it's likely that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang will be the leaders for the next 10 years, if we're predicting forward. But something actually very interesting happened. These are the top 7 leaders. These are the standing committee of the Politburo, and I won't go over their details. But one thing that happened is that there's just 7, as opposed to 9. And the previous Politburo, there were 9 people, and each one of them has a portfolio of policies that they are responsible for. So what do they do with 2 of the portfolios? Well, one of the portfolios that supposedly has been moved out of, has been so-called depoliticized a little bit, has been national security. The other one has been propaganda. Okay, now one of these members has actually been in charge of propaganda for many years, so it's likely he'll still have a large influence. But what they're basically doing is they're opening up the possibility for more reform by saying that a lot of the media affairs that are going on in China for the next 5 or 10 years should not be something that immediately comes up to the Politburo level. Okay, that's what they're basically saying. And that's a big change. There's also been a lot of things like this. Okay, these are photographs of a local official from Shanxi province, and I believe he's wearing a Rolex. And so people on the internet captured photos taken from local media, and they spread these on the internet to show that he's wearing a Rolex. And so they asked him, how did you afford a Rolex on your salary? And he couldn't, and I believe in his case he actually resigned. So there's been a lot of, this is called like the human flesh search engine, in Chinese, the use of the internet to pull out details, in this case even using official propaganda. These are all official photos. Similar, about a year ago, during the last National People's Congress and Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference in Beijing, these are all delegates coming into Beijing, and somebody has gone through and matching up all the things they're wearing. So there's the man with the delegate with the Hermes belt, and it says that costs about $900. Okay, and there's the Hermes bag, the Burberry bag, okay? And they've actually gone through, people in different parts of China have actually leveraged what they know in their locality to put out on the internet, well, this is what this person does, and then they'll put out, this is what they're officially making. So you have to ask, how can they afford a $1,000 bag or a $900 belt? Excuse me? They easily go, well, in fact, some people have said, yes, in fact, I'm wearing a fake. That has been an excuse. That's been an excuse to be able to say that. The other thing as well, the human flesh search engine also plays a role. There's a famous image. The photograph on the left is not exactly that, but you'll notice it has the same policeman. The policeman's name is actually Liu Bo, and we know this because he participated in kind of stopping some protests in Sichuan province about the building of a new metals factory. And so there's a famous photograph of him chasing a protester, and he's a very active, gung-ho, type security guard, policeman for the local province. And people then began to take his image and transpose it onto other things. And so here he is chasing, I think that's Liu Xiang, the Olympic runner, right? And then a puppy in the upper right one. Which I think shows, I like these photographs because it shows us something else that's going on here. First of all, that at the same time you have people using the internet to find out the name of this guard. Okay, much in the same way, I didn't put it up here, the security guard who, at the protests at UC Davis, who sprayed tear gas into the face of protesters, that man's name was revealed, on the newspaper. He still has his job. This man was persuaded to retire early once his name actually became known. So it's interesting that now there's been a breaking down of privacy, and officials are finding it a lot harder to hide. At the same time, there's also kind of a lightheartedness, a whimsical or comical nature to this form of, in a way, protest. I think this is another good example of this. This is called shootering. China last year launched its first airplane from its aircraft carrier, and so you have the men doing the shooter position to indicate that the plane should take off. And then all over the internet, Chinese people began posting their own photos of themselves imitating. I like the man holding the cat myself, but you can find all parts of it. And what's interesting is many of them are actually nationalistic, but they're also playful as well. And so it's interesting that there's a mix now of, I would say, of kind of the whimsical and the much more political. I would say almost a comedy side. China doesn't have a Daily Show, okay, or a Stephen Colbert, but it's working there in that direction. This was also December. This is a series of, the left-hand side is photographs of major newspapers in China. And this was December 16th with the massacre at the school in Connecticut. And these are all headlines talking about America's tragedy and America weeping over the killing of all these innocent school children. And on the right-hand side is actually Xinjiang Rebao, and this is a newspaper in an area in China which had a similar incident on the same day. A man went into a school and he actually stabbed 22 children. All of them survived, thank God. However, there's some interesting contrast here, right? Chinese newspapers are heavily covering this massacre in America. At the same time, the local newspaper in the locality where the stabbing occurred has nothing. And in fact, it has a story talking about how the education system is doing quite well, but nothing, at least on the front page, about what actually has just happened. And so this drew an awful lot of ire, and protest amongst Chinese people on the internet. As well, there's been also some very famous, you could say, scams or errors in the state-run media, the usually faultless state-run media. So, People's Daily on the left ran a story taken from The Onion, which is a satirical website in the United States, when The Onion named Kim Jong-un the sexiest man alive for 2012. And People's Daily ran this as a story. Similarly, there was a local mayor from eastern China, Hu Renbao, who somebody took his face and photoshopped it onto Time magazine and changed the words. And Xinhua, the national news agency, actually ran this image, even though it was obviously badly photoshopped, okay, and perhaps done for kind of comical or even protest reasons. And what I find interesting about these, and having worked in Xinhua, is that it seems there are many, many layers through which things have to go before they can actually be sent out, published or broadcast or something on the internet. So the fact that these actually went out either suggests that they've eliminated all these layers, or actually that people are maybe intentionally trying to embarrass some of the national news organizations. And I know my colleagues will also talk about some protests amongst journalists that began to happen in December and January and earlier this year, with journalists in China saying, we need to actually have more responsibility and freedom. Then there was a whole series of things happened with CCTV, China Central Television. And CCTV ran a series called Are You Happy? in the Xingfuma, and so they got some very interesting responses from people. And you can go on the internet and look at these responses. People knew that this was CCTV asking them, "Are you happy?" And they knew that this was serving a vaguely political purpose, since it was getting ready for the party Congress coming up, in November. And so their answers are quite revealing. So in one, the man on the left, the far left one, they ask a migrant worker, and he doesn't want to be, interviewed, but they ask him, they said, "Are you happy?" "Ni xingfu And he says, "No, 我姓曾." And he says, so he plays on the word that "ni xingfu" means could be "are you happy?" or it could be "are you named Fu?" And he says, "No, I'm named Zeng." And so he turns it on its head. The middle one is a group of students at Tsinghua University, smart-ass students, what do you expect? But they asked them, they said, "Are you happy?" And he says, "No, I just broke up with my girlfriend. This is like the worst possible time. Thank you for asking me." And the man on the right, they actually said, "Are you happy?" And he says, "Well," he said, "No, actually, I'm unhappy because I've been talking to you and I've lost my place in line." And he says, "I'm really unhappy about this." And so again, what's interesting about this is that even the state media is running things that poke fun at the state media, which is very, very interesting. Then finally, the last part, and these are some older images, but the Vive la France one is somewhat related, but not so much to what I'm going to say. But the lower one says in Chinese, "Muammar Gaddafi is a liar." This is actually from 2011, and so it's on the protests in Libya. So these are Libyans protesting, and they actually put up a sign in Chinese. Okay, now we're used to seeing, like for example, the top one. If they put up a sign in France to thank, since France played a leading role in Libya, and they know that foreign media will pick it up, right? So why were these Libyans running a sign in Chinese? Obviously, Chinese media is playing a role, okay, and they know that. And so they actually created a sign in Chinese. So that's actually one of the things that's new. The Chinese state-run media have become very transnational. Okay, they're all over the world and they're competing. And in the United States, we have the scholar Joseph Nye who talks about soft power. And I would say that the American government, not too many people actually believe in the concept of soft power. The Chinese government loves the concept of soft power, and it's making huge investments, even contrary to what Joseph Nye would say, which is that governments don't actually have the ability to influence soft power. It's more capitalism and companies and Hollywood, things beyond a government's control. But the Chinese government's making huge investments to try to compete with CNN. They made, those of you here in Houston may have seen the China Daily, the English language version of the Chinese government's newspaper, actually had a Houston edition. And I don't know whether it's continued, but they spent a lot of money on this. The estimates are, perhaps $1 billion in just the last few years. The right-hand side of it is also a very beautiful Rice version of this as well. This is Eve Bauer, who graduated in Asian Studies from Rice about 2008, and she went over to China and she worked as a CCTV reporter. Okay, when she walks around China today, she's now actually an independent journalist, looking at things like rare metals and protests and things like that. When she walks around China, she's noticed everywhere she goes because she taught English and it was on TV, on CCTV, and she also did these stories. And so she's very much kind of a media personality. If you look at CCTV now, most of the reporters overseas are actually foreigners. They're foreign nationals. They're not actually Chinese nationals. So that's the other thing as well. The state media, even China Central Television, they're hiring more and more foreigners to actually work for them. They themselves are becoming transnational, even at the personality level. So that's actually what's actually quite interesting. So it kind of raises the question, has China's political communications fundamentally changed in the last few decades? And how will these changes affect Chinese politics and reform? Well, we decided that we'd bring in several experts. One of them is Dr. Ann Koosh, who will be our next speaker. And she is an expert on Chinese media and also environmental studies and transnational film. And then Dr. Chen Wenhu Chen from UT at the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, who is an expert on transnational entrepreneurial networks and also use of digital media. And so I would say these are the real media experts. But that said, let me kind of just toss in my own 10 cents from the own research. Those of you who are familiar with the Transnational China Project know that we've been looking at advertisements and outdoor advertisements for the last 15 or 16 years. So I'll just give you a few examples to support the idea that that outdoor advertising, even outdoor political advertising, has become very transnational, very global in recent years. So outdoor advertising, this is an ad from 2009 in Beijing. It's an advertisement for a bank. And it's clearly a young Chinese person. That's a college, probably somewhere in the United States, right? And it talks about here are the services available. So what has shifted in China is now you have a middle class who are sending their kids to the United States. So banking services include helping your kid who is overseas studying. Okay, that tells you that there's a large middle class that you can advertise in a subway to try to influence. This is a classic photo from 1999, an advertisement from Ericsson. And this Ericsson cell phones, right? But if you look at this and you ask people, where is this? It's interesting the answers you get. Most Westerners look at it and go, oh, look at that pasta fork. You know, that's a Western pasta fork, which is true. Most Chinese don't use a Western pasta fork like that. But if you ask most Chinese people, they will say, oh, that's a Chinese kitchen. Because those bottles in the background look like zhangyou, you know, soy sauce and vinegar. Traditional Chinese soy sauce and vinegar. And Ericsson did this deliberately, and they had a whole series of ads. What they're trying to imply is that there's a Chinese middle class of people, of professionals, who are jet-setting around the world. And so yes, their kitchen is in Shanghai, but they carry their pasta fork with them, right? And a love of pasta, right? So there's a whole series of things like this. Or here's one, here's for a watch. It's a young woman, Chinese woman. She's obviously you know, at a wedding somewhere, but it's probably in Europe or the United States. Here's a common one. Toyota, you know, plays up this transnational lifestyle. So it talks about Sydney in the late afternoon, Shanghai at dusk, New York at dawn, and Paris at noon. Okay, so they're drawing the implication that Shanghai is just like these other, you know, very global, very cosmopolitan, transnational spaces. This would be like the old traditional, you know, type of political communication. These are the 7 things you shouldn't do in Shanghai. Don't spit, don't litter, you know, don't all those types of things in public spaces, basically. This was also one from Beijing in 2000, right? Very badly, crudely photoshopped. But they're trying to show that Beijing is an international center. So they've got the International Hotel there on the left, and for some reason, a boat with water background, which is interesting because Beijing doesn't have a port. Tianjin is the nearest port, but it's not part of Beijing. And so I think what they're trying to show is that Beijing is very international. So these are the old style of advertisements that we've captured, and we're actually putting them in an archive. More recently, though, this is a typical common theme. Men and women are equal. Okay, but you can see it's a little more stylistically original. We're choosing of famous people, in this case an actor, to represent a public health project. In this case, it's fighting AIDS. So a famous actor is part of an effort to fight AIDS. 2009 was the 60th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. So many, many ads in Beijing were like this. Here's a young couple. They're at the Summer Palace. She's wearing she has a Dolce & Gabbana bag, right? You know, so very subtle little signs put in here to indicate that we've arrived, you know, economically. And also getting more playful. You know, so this is about, you know, being civilized while you ride the subway. So I don't know who these goofballs are, but the idea is that you should actually be, it's not just a scary place, it's actually kind of a fun place as well. And then there's several ones that I put in here. These are public service advertisements that received awards in different parts of China, and then they became spread throughout the other parts of China. And this one says, you know, when you go out for a night on the town, don't forget the people you're leaving behind. Okay, so it's a woman heading out in the town. She's got a diamond earring. If you look through the earring, you see mom. Okay, poor mom at the door. Oh, where's the daughter gone? You know, so it's kind of blatant. And yes, for some reason, it's the responsibility of the women, right, to be responsible for mom who's stuck behind at home. Or this one, which is a little more subtle. I'll let you grasp this one for a minute. See if we can figure out what it is. So it's a traffic signal on the right, and it's saying, you know, it's green, begin swimming. On the left, those are all the towers in downtown Shanghai. You know, so it's an ad about global warming, right? Because Shanghai is just above the water. So the idea is in the future, if we're not careful, when the light turns green, we're going to swim to cross the street. in Shanghai. So I think what this shows us is that there's still actually some restrictions on certain topics. Religious groups can't advertise. You can't really use protest for outdoor political communication. But both commercial and public service advertisements have become much more transnational, with transnational middle-class lifestyles and behavior. And now you actually also have foreign advertising firms and companies actually advertising in public spaces, and also NGOs. So World Wildlife Fund and other foreign NGOs are actually advertising in Chinese urban spaces as well. So let me go ahead and stop there and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ann Koosh. And you can see her biography in the nice pamphlet here. We'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Lewis for organizing this event, and for the Baker Institute for their amazing support during this past year here in Houston. So I became involved in working in Chinese media through a rather untraditional path. When I was a study abroad student in 1999, I moved to the Beijing Film Studio Work Unit and began working on film productions there during the first period of time in which American producers were coming to make Chinese films in China. And then I went back to China to study for a year at the Beijing Film Academy, where I worked developing some of the first focus groups for Chinese film production, and then also lived in the People's Daily compound for 6 months. So during that time, I had the opportunity to work with colleagues and to get to know all of the residents in the Beijing Film Studio Work Unit, as well as in the People's Daily Work Unit. And most recently, I was doing my PhD at UCLA on Sino-US media co-productions focused on film production. However, today I'll be talking about both the results of the recent leadership transition and some of the speeches that we heard that were related to media in China during that period. Excuse me. Okay. Pardon me. All right. So what I'd like to do is talk about how three different types of messaging that came through following the leadership transition in March ultimately are interacting and intersecting and shaping our understanding of environmental issues in China, media issues in China, and then economic development issues in China. And while these are things that we frequently talk about separately, as media scholars, as political scientists, as environmental studies scholars, ultimately, because of some of the larger policy rubrics that were set up both by Wen Jiabao when he was leaving, and also in a notable speech by Li Keqiang when he was coming in, we see that there are actually some really interesting overlaps that are really significant to understanding all three of these issues. And particularly given the fact that we're in the Baker Institute and in Houston, I'd like to talk about how these have kind of larger implications for China's environmental policies, specifically as it relates to media, the circulation of media, and larger environmental issues. So one of the most significant changes in the media landscape in March was the collapsing of the General Administration of Press and Publication into SARFT, the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television. So ultimately, what this has led to is a notable convergence, centralizing of digital regulation. Now, this is important in the sense that whereas before GAP and SARFT had separate oversight of different forms of digital distribution of media, now GAP and SARFT have combined. So as a result, we're seeing a convergence and a centralization of digital media regulation. Now, this is particularly relevant when we think about the fact that when there are more regulators, there are both more people looking at media, but there are also more people who might overlook something, or when there are different silos for regulation, it's possible that certain things would get overlooked. So the fact that this is centralizing actually suggests a much stronger This suggests a much stronger, more focused attempt to control digital media on the very highest levels. So one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is the relationship between Facebook and Twitter. And these are areas where, this is an area where the convergence between SARFT and GAP is particularly significant. So at this point, it's possible to access Twitter. Twitter is blocked in China, but it's possible to access it through a VPN server, a virtual private network. And then to recirculate that information on Weibo. Now, one of the particularly interesting parts about this is Twitter and Weibo were initially, because it's both entertainment and news, it was initially covered by both different agencies. But now that they're being collapsed together, we see a centralization of this regulation of both entertainment and of press in digital spaces. So it also nods to the kind of blending of journalism and journalism and entertainment that Dr. Lewis referred to earlier, which is also complicating larger issues of media regulation. So now, how does this relate to the economic development piece and the environmental piece? So one of the things that got the most substantial press following leadership transition was Xi Jinping's discussion of a China dream, and this has been discussed largely in the security context, whether or not this means a buildup of Chinese military capability or whether or not it's a soft power consideration. But it's also been highlighted as an emphasis on China's economic growth. Now, how does this really feed into larger issues? But this wasn't the only concept, and this wasn't the only major concept that was present in the leadership transition and the larger discussions. And one of the really significant points that I was particularly interested in, at least, was this idea not just of a China dream, but of an ecological society. So conceptually, and when we're looking at China's leadership over the next 5 to 10 years, what does it mean that there are these two conceptual rubrics that are being placed in many ways together and in some ways at odds? How can we reconcile the idea of economic growth with an ecological society, and what does that ultimately mean? And when Wen Jiabao was leaving his office, and when Li Keqiang was entering, both of them highlighted the significance of environmental preservation and an ecological society in China, which notably has actually arisen. A lot of this pressure has arisen from media considerations as it relates to issues like Beijing smog. So these policy issues don't exist in a vacuum. And when we had a high-level visitor come through, he highlighted the fact that large amounts of Weibo posts and Twitter posts were shaping his experience in policymaking in China. So it's important to note. So this is an example of the U.S. Embassy Twitter feed, which many of you probably know about. It every hour gives the Beijing air quality readings for PM 2.5, PM 10, and is a barometer that people who have access to Twitter use to identify the air quality risk in China. But notably, as we discussed earlier, people can access Twitter via VPN and therefore have access to this information. So when there's large scale access to this type of information about environmental issues, as well as national access to images, in addition to the actual experience of pollution, then it complicates this idea of the China dream, particularly as it relates to economic growth. I'd like to share a quick personal anecdote about this. So we see this image of Beijing and its kind of terrible pollution. But when I was in Beijing the last time, I was riding in a cab, and I was speaking with the cab driver, and I was like, wow, the pollution today is really terrible. I'm coughing, I can't see the street. And he was like, oh, it's not pollution, it's fog. And I was like, are you sure it's fog? Because I was like, because I lived in Beijing 10 years ago and it wasn't this foggy. And he was like, no, it's fog. So one of the reasons why media is so significant is because in some ways it presents an alternative vision or an alternative understanding to what people are experiencing on a daily basis. So in some ways, if they read something on Weibo or if they read something on Twitter, it makes it more real than actually seeing it, or it resituates it. So that dynamic, that intersection between media and lived experience and economic growth is particularly significant as we move forward. So this highlights the question of when does talking about the weather ultimately become a political act? So there have been reports of people's access to media being restricted during high pollution days, and also not just talking about the weather, but talking about waterways. So, for example, in November in Ningbo, there were large protests surrounding an oil chemical additive that were being processed outside of Ningbo, which is a city in Zhejiang province, which is very quite wealthy. So there were reports, Weibo was shut down, but Twitter was actually kept open during that time period. So reports were being sent out through Twitter about this event, and then being filtered back through Weibo from users who had access to both types of accounts. So it's not just talking about the weather, but talking about one's natural environment, talking about the water, talking about these kind of very basic quality of life things that ultimately can potentially complicate issues, the idea of the China dream, also complicate this idea of the ecological society, and also complicate, for example, oil investments as well as the manufacturing processes in China. So I think it's important when examining these issues to look not only at not only look at the economic development piece, but how media is ultimately shaping citizen understanding of economic development on the very most basic levels. So ultimately, there are three things that I'd like to highlight today. So following the 12th National People's following policy changes, it highlights the ways in which development, media, and the environment are entwined in the PRC, even in the highest policy circles. So this isn't just an issue. This isn't just an issue of grassroots environmental activism. So often we think of environmental activism in the U.S. as being primarily a function of civil society, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, whereas in China, because this issue has become so substantial, it becomes a larger issue on the highest levels of government that need to be taken into consideration into broader economic goals and at the highest levels of leadership. So, at the same time, environmental issues are then challenging development goals, but are also deeply entwined with development goals. So these things need to be looked at in concert with one another. How is it possible to work in China? How is it possible to develop a manufacturing to develop large city infrastructure while also working with people to maintain a healthy environment, to maintain stability? So, and this kind of gets back to a larger issue as it relates to both the issues of the China dream and the Ecological Society. Both of these are, in many ways, can be traced back to the desire to maintain larger economic stability. And then finally, getting back to this idea of digital media regulation, we're seeing rapid growth and rapid change, rapid pluralization in terms of the types of services that are available, the globalization of services, both in terms of what is available in China, the numbers of services that are available, the numbers of users, the numbers of mobile users. We're also seeing a lot of foreign direct investment in the media industries. For example, several major Hollywood studios have invested in Chinese social media networks as digital distribution platforms. as well as a way to enter the Chinese social network, which is expanding the potential range for social media networks in China. But at the same time, we're seeing a trend toward centralization of government oversight of Chinese social networks. So ultimately, that tension is something that will be very interesting to look at as it plays out over the next 5 to 10 years, or even actually over the next 6 months, truthfully. So I'd like to thank you all for your kind attention. And I would like to turn the podium over to Professor Chen Wen from UT Austin, who kindly joined us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to come here. It's really my great honor and a pleasure to talk about my research on Chinese social media, as well as the implications for the politics of reform in China. So, topic for today, dream work, media, shoe, and the Chinese dream. Okay. Okay. So just use this one. Yeah. Okay. So, have you already noticed that we are meeting on a very interesting day? I'm actually surprised that so many people actually show up. And today, what make a round in Sina Weibo, Xinlang Weibo is now we can use Facebook and Twitter in China. Just click on that photo. And it really says so much about the internet and the social media in China right now, because it's playful, it's sarcastic, there are more bystanders who retweeted than participants who commented. Okay, so you may have heard a lot about the power of the internet. The next revolution will be Twitter, and what happened in North Africa and the Middle East is the Facebook revolution. And we also know there are tons of research shows that there's a virtuous circle between news media use and the participation in protest across more than 40 countries with varying levels of social economic development. And you're probably also familiar with the mobilization thesis developed by Pippa Norris, a political scientist at Harvard. So the internet supposedly allow freer, faster, more transparent information flow and communication. By doing that, it enhances the visibility and significance of social issues, and in particular, it empowers. It gives previously oppressed group and people an affordable tool for political participation. So much about the mobilization thesis. There are also this normalization thesis. Look at who is actually using the internet, who are on the wrong side of the digital divide. And for those who are able to use and access the internet, you probably heard from Facebook, the likes like, the hater hate. We often use the latest information and communication technology to what we have been doing all the time along. We selectively choose our exposure to media, there has great concerns in this country about the echo chamber of like-minded people consuming same type of media, developing, reinforcing similar type of political views and attitude. And in the last several years, there in particular a type of concern about young people's participation in civic engagement. We have spent so much time on Facebook, like the issues, to show our support. Such trivial online participation, well, by itself is not harmful, can distract us from the real issues. And how these dynamics going to play out in China? Okay, so the Chinese internet is full of paradoxes. Rapid growth, you can see that in 2005, less than 10% of the population use the internet, but as of the end of 2012, more than 48%. And actually in 2008, China has already become the country with the most internet users in the whole world. And what they use it for? If you look at the different type of social media outlet, from IM on the top, to online forums, to Weibo, the microblogging, to social networking sites, you can see often hundreds, millions of Chinese using these social media platforms to gain information, to communicate with their friends and families, to shop around, to have some fun, watching videos or playing games. And put all this together, what does this mean for a changing Chinese media landscape? And what does this mean? What's the implications for the Chinese society? One thing before I move forward, I also want to emphasize even 42% of the population are now using the internet, which means there are about 60% of the population have not get on the internet yet. And if you look at who they are often the less educated. People live in the rural countryside, women, older people. And now, scholars often examine the Chinese media landscape using a binary framework. The old media and the new media. The old media, TV, radio, newspaper, tightly controlled, censored by the government. They were designed and remain by and large the mouthpiece of the party. They are the propaganda tools for the state. And if you look at the internet, it's new, it's difficult to control, it gives people a lot of autonomy and freedom. However, if you look closer at this argument, here comes a question. And in particular become significant since the Arab Spring. And many scholars actually use China as a counterexample of the dictator's dilemma. So seems that at least on the surface, for the time being, China, or the Chinese government, has quite successfully harnessed the power of the internet without really undergoing any significant political change. But if we compare the old and the new media in China and go more into the details, into the deeper level, you can see that either the old or the new media, they both under control of the government. There are double logic that dominate the Chinese media landscape right now. First, the logic of political propaganda. They all have to serve the party state, either they are digital or they are print media. And second, except a few media outlets sponsored, subsidized by the central government, like CCTV, like People's Daily, all the rest have to figure out how they can attract enough audience to survive on the market. So under these two logic, political propaganda and the corporate profit making, you can see that it creates an extremely interesting space for both the old and new media to operate, because they have to dance within the party line and also keep a very, very close eye on their bottom line. Okay, so the internet paradox, as I mentioned, not only the old media has been under tight state control, the internet has been also closely monitored, surveilled, censored by the central and local government. So I think you probably all have heard about the Great Firewall of China. And if Chinese users want to use Facebook and Twitter, they still have to jump the Great Firewall. Nonetheless, there are many, many loopholes in this wall, and there are great regional variations. The type of censorship in Beijing can be dramatically different than those in Canton, than those in Tibet. And the Chinese government has used several different strategies to censor the internet, including totally blocking, black out for time being, or just pull the plug. For instance, in 2008, just before the Olympic Game in Beijing, there were ethnic riots in Xinjiang, so the government decided just to cut the internet off in the whole region for 6 months. Okay. And even more trickier, the government actually have built a massive machinery of web commentators, often called as the 50 Cent Party in China, because as the rumor goes, they would receive 50 cents for each pro-government post they shared on the internet. And I think the news stories from New York Times and the Wall Street Journals last fall shows how intensive the Chinese government has gone after foreign media as well as foreign corporations. Nonetheless, if you look at it from the user side, there's a genuine lack of political interest. However, on the other hand, increasingly, it's very difficult for any ordinary Chinese citizen to ignore some of the environmental issues, some of the social issues in China, because it's right there in the air you breathe. It's right there in the food you consume. So food safety and air pollution has drawn a lot of concerns from all social strata. Make it even more complicated. Nonetheless, most Chinese internet users think the government should manage and control the internet. Okay, so the censorship has grown actually even tighter in the last several years, not the other way around. And normally we don't get much insight into how the censorship works. Sometimes we get a glimpse, and this news article is one of those. Back in January this year, the propaganda minister, the deputy chair of Beijing, just tried to show off his great achievement. And he announced that in Beijing alone, there are 60,000 people employed by the city for propaganda. That's the active word they use in China. And this is only a small part of it. There are 2 million informants. That means this is news in Sina Weibo, because how many people actually living in Beijing?
10 million?
20 million.
20 million.
Then this means 10%. 10% of people living in the city work for the propaganda ministry. I don't know whether the propaganda minister was exaggerating or the government have really have such control. And he actually encouraged all these 2 million people open a Weibo account, read Weibo, post on Weibo, and study Weibo. So we can utilize the positive energy of the internet. What does that mean? To influence the public opinion, to affect the emerging public sphere on Chinese social media. Okay, so Chinese news site. QQ, Sina, 163, Sohu, and iPhone. I believe you haven't heard most of them. And the top social media platform in China, QQ again, Sina Weibo, Renren is a copycat of Facebook, Youku, a copycat you can figure out, YouTube, and Douban is a review and recommendation site. So by now you probably have already noticed that the indigenous firms dominate the Chinese internet industry. Most of these companies I just mentioned, they are Chinese. Although many of their founders, VCs, and executives are the so-called sea turtles, were trained in the US or Western European countries. The very transnational entrepreneur I studied for my dissertation got their degree here, worked for American companies here, and eventually returned to China to start up. Why the indigenous firm dominate the internet industry in China? Because the international companies either left because of the censorship, or if you believe the Chinese government, because they were not able to gain a significant chunk of the Chinese market. Oh, they're still trying to get back in. I want to share this with you. I think you already noticed who these 2 persons were, right? Mark Zuckerberg and his then fiancée, now wife, Priscilla Chan. And they made a tour in Shanghai before their wedding, spring this year. And somehow, and I think this is actually another sign of how the Chinese society, even foreigners, is constantly monitored, surveilled by the government. Somehow, the 2 ended up in a documentary made by CCTV. and if you look at here, Chinese police, this is a CCTV program. And the documentary is about, China really need more police officers. Okay, so, and most of the Chinese companies, they are also grassroots. They are not set up by the so-called press-lings, or people who used to have a very close connection with the government. They were the sea turtles. What gave them success was their education and their international experience. So they set up private-owned companies instead of becoming part of state-owned. On the other hand, you can see that the current Chinese leadership has made a great effort to incorporate them into the ruling elite. And as Anne just mentioned, just in this month, there was this big political conferences. The NPC and the CPPCC meeting in Beijing elected the new leadership, and you can see that all the Chinese tech titans are at the meeting, including Pony Ma, the founder of QQ or Tencent, including Robin Li, the founder of Baidu, and other top-level entrepreneurs in the Chinese industry. And then this should not surprise you at all. According to Chinese law, all internet companies need to exercise censorship. And on top of that, they also exercise consciously self-censorship. And for instance, Sina Weibo, right now, the ruling social media microblogging service in China. Back in 2011, they already have more than 700 in-house censors just to monitor what the people post on Weibo and delete them. There's actually just a new study came out last week showing that how effective these in-house censors could be. 90% of Weibo that would deemed as politically sensitive would be deleted within 1 hour. And that's an interesting time period, right? Because Sina Weibo can come back to the government and say, hey, we tried our best, right? We are really effective. But within 1 hour, many things could happen. And one search result. So I actually just searched the Bo Xinlai, the disgraced politician, yesterday, and this is what I found. And again, to show you the flexibility of Chinese censorship, the trending topic this week on Sina Weibo is the Chinese First Lady. Peng Liyuan, who accompanied her husband Xi Jinping to visit Russia and Africa. And this is really, the most presentable First Lady China had since a very long time. So she is all over the place. But can you believe back in last fall, just a few months ago, before the 18th Party Congress, if you search Peng Liyuan over there, you would get this too. Based on relevant law and regulation, the search result cannot be shown. And of course, Chinese internet users have developed many strategies to get around, right? One strategy is to use homonyms or code word. And Steve has already talked about the power of the internet, in particular in terms of exposing of corrupted officials. And this is the latest victim of such exposing. And he is not just a normal corrupted official. He is actually the top ideologue, the dean of Marxism right now in China. And somehow got involved into a very juicy, ugly scandal. And it was so important. Hu Jintao's report at the 18th Party Congress was actually based on his work, talking about China or the party should have confidence in its path, in its theory, in its system. And a lot of studies have paid attention to censorship and online activism, right? How Chinese internet users use the internet to communicate, to participate, and to expose such officials. Here's one question. To what extent internet use and all these discussions on social media was related to what's happening on the street? Is there a connection? Or totally two different parts of current Chinese social life? Although many scholars consider China as the counterexample of the dictator's dilemma, actually collective event of contentious politics, protest, appeal, demonstration has been on the rise since the mid-1990s. And by this far, it's mainly driven by social economic injustice, rather than any across-the-board normative political agenda. Nonetheless, since 2008, the Chinese government has developed a comprehensive stability maintenance mechanism to suppress, to control collective event. How big this stability maintenance program is? Because we're here at the Baker Institute, I think you probably know the Chinese military budget very well. And the budget for this program is larger than the Chinese military budget. And in early this year, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences just released a new report analyzing protests and demonstrations and appeal in China, and what we found that basically you can categorize them into three types. First, making up 50% of collective event is land seizure. The government grab land from farmers, market it up to developers. The developer build apartment building, sell it to urban residents or anyone who can afford. And this is actually the secret of wealth creation in China since the late 1990s. And then environmental and labor dispute. And we know that the low environmental standard and low labor protection in China has been one of the two hallmarks of China's export economy. And other issues. But if you look at the nature of the contentious politics, the nature of collective event, I think you can sense to what extent the government is actually able to solve this conflict. It's not going to be easy, because both the local and the central government live on from the money they got by saving farmers' land, and how much China can improve environmental protections, labor protections in the near future without jeopardizing its international competence. Okay, so my colleague Yan Longzhang and I did a study looking at why people participate in appeal and protests in China. And we used some of the sociological theories of social movement, and what we found that is grievance are important, both individual grievance and collective grievance are important to motivate people to participate in protests and appeal. And if you look at the media and the internet use, we look at the TV, we look at radio, we look at newspapers and the internet, and what we found is that in general, they have quite limited impact on appeal and protest participation. If we look closer, the only significant media to participation in contentious politics is radio. We are still trying to figure out why this is the case, because we were thinking internet was behind that, right? But I think on the other hand, it also tells us a lot what the internet can do and what the internet cannot do. So ever since 2011, there's this question hovering around in China and in the heart of many China experts. Will the jasmine bloom in China? Is there going to be a revolution coming soon in China? How long the People's Party can walk along that tightrope, keeping a balance? And they have learned a lot from the downfalls of the dictators in Egypt, in Tunisia. They come to the grand narrative of the Chinese dream. And the term was actually first coined by Xi Jinping just a couple of weeks after the 18th Party Congress. And in the photo, you can see that he brought the whole class of the new Politburo to the National Museum of China. And for those who know the geography of Beijing, you know where it is. It's right on Tiananmen Square, just across the People's Congress Hall, a very prominent politically and socially. And they visited the exhibition, The Road to Restoration, at the National Museum. And where Xi Jinping raised the new narrative. The Chinese dream is what? Achieving the great restoration has been the greatest dream of the Chinese people since the modern time. And this really revived many public intellectuals, opinion leaders, and the Chinese citizens at that time. I want to highlight the Chinese dream is not just a spin of American dream. Because what's the American dream about? You know better than me. And is there anything about individuals' happiness? Is there anything about equal opportunity, regardless the circumstance of people's birth or position? And as I mentioned, nonetheless, the grand narrative of Chinese dream has really revived the Chinese intellectual. So the Southern Weekly is the most dominant Chinese newspaper. And every New Year's Day, they would have their annual editorial called the Southern Weekly New Year Greetings. And that's very influential in China and in the Chinese cultural circles. So they decided to catch up on the Chinese dream. And that was their original editorial title, China's Dream, the Dream of Constitutionalism. They try to bank on this Chinese dream, right, to push the envelope a little bit. Probably now time for a little bit political reform. What's the response from the censor? The story was killed. And this was actually published. We are closer to our dream than ever before. Not mention at all about any political reform or social justice. And the editors and journalists at Southern Weekly were so disappointed, and they started a resistance on Sina Weibo. And that was right in the first week of the new year. A few weeks after the 18th Congress, Party Congress, and 2 months before the NPP, when the new leadership would be confirmed. This is a big event in China because people were thinking this are test, a challenge for the new leadership. What are they going to do? What's going to be their response? Are they going to allow even some talks on political reform? Oh, the journalists at Southern Weekly would be harshly suppressed. The result was somewhere in between. After tens of thousands Weibo were posted, retweeted, and deleted, the result was both sides back off a little bit, and the compromise goes on. Nonetheless, the whole event shows that the division within the political elite, the division within the censors, there's not one single censor. There are multiple layers. And in particular, if you look at the role of Sina Weibo on it, it deliberately allows some of the Weibo not being deleted for time enough to be shared, to be retweeted, to be discussed. And it also shows an emerging civil society because who participate in the discussion and who show their support to Southern Weekly, not just the usual suspect, the public intellectuals, but also queens of soap opera, real estate tycoons, and also many, many ordinary citizens. So it really shows the emergence, the growing civil society. And I really enjoyed Steve's comments earlier. Well, there's a comment on Wall Street Journal saying China's journalists are not revolutionaries. But is it fair to expect the journalists become revolutionaries? And I really see a lot of hope in this incident because it really shows that there are so many segments in the Chinese society right now are hoping for change, are willing for change. And back to the Chinese dream, during the NPP in March, at his acceptance speech, Xi Jinping, in his 25-minute talk, mentioned the Chinese dream 9 times and gained 13 times applause. And of course, this motivated him to talk about more about the Chinese dream. And if we borrow some insight from political scientists and sociologists and their work on social movement, you can see at the macro level, resources, grievances, and the media use motivated people to participate in conscious politics. At the macro level, what more a society if there are alternatives? Does the alternative have organizing strategies? How about the structure of political opportunities? And then, how is the society, social issues are framed, shared, discussed by the media? What's the narrative strategy? These all have important implications for contentious politics. And right now, the Chinese dream dominant the political discussion in China. And political scientists have pointed out the relation between protest and the social political development is curvilinear. Protest is most likely to happen in regimes with mid-level political openness and economic development. And you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so Xi Jinping just visited Russia, and at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, he delivered a speech in which he talked about the shoes. Only the wearer know whether the shoe fits the foot or not. Only the people know the development path of the nation. And to show you, even there has been great media censorship, and the editors and journalists, even from a party newspaper, can always figure out ways to carry some interesting message. He delivered his speech March 23rd, and then next day, you can see the headline in the Yangtze River Daily. Okay, of course, the headline was about the shoes. And then look at this picture. Do you know this guy?
Beckham.
David Beckham. Having a tour in Wuhan, where the Yangtze River Daily is published. And he just tried to show kids, junior soccer players, his perfect free kick. Unfortunately, you can see what shoes he wears and whether it's fit or not. So I'm going to stop here. I'm very happy to answer any questions you have, because
Actually, look, all three of us can just come and sit for maybe 10 minutes or so. We'll just take some questions, and then we'll adjourn for refreshments outside. Did we have any questions over here?
There was a curious report, and NPR did some follow-up news stories about the Chinese news agency leasing 100% of the radio time at a Galveston radio station. This was about 2.5, 3 years ago. And there were some complaints in the local area that the reporting sort of reeked of propaganda. And it's intriguing because the station is owned by Americans, but the time is leased. And the NPR story talked about the fact that the Chinese news agency felt that the broadcast range would go to Houston, and that was a mistake. It doesn't actually go that far. So it sort of demonstrated this kind of immaturity of media buys and kind of a naivete about the U.S. market. Could you remark or comment on that, and what other parts of the country are experiencing the same kind of media?
Maybe we could both.
Yeah.
So what I would like to do is actually comment on the kind of comparative situation that we encounter. So we're seeing that those challenges on both sides. So American companies trying to go to China to work. So the other field that I work on is film co-productions, and there have been even very prominent film studios that have gone to China to work on co-productions. For example, the Weinstein brothers, who are this kind of Hollywood power team, actually got their permission to shoot in China revoked, and then it was reinstated, and then when they were trying to distribute their film, it was delayed so that they were able to make essentially no profits on the film. So it's not just Chinese media buys in the U.S. that we're seeing, kind of misplacement. It can even be at the highest levels for American companies that are trying to enter the U.S. market. But I do think it's particularly interesting to see the emphasis on reaching overseas Chinese communities in places where there are large populations, like in Texas and in Houston in particular. And actually, I'd like to yield that over to Chen Wenhong to speak to, because she's been in Texas longer than I have. I don't know if you have any insight on Chinese.
Well, I don't know about very much about the particular Galveston case, but one thing I can see that the Chinese media really take globalization very seriously, and also bankrolled by the Chinese government to enter the international media market, and not only for economic reasons, but also in the search of soft power and also political influence, in particular in Africa. And Chinese media has been very, very active in the print broadcasting media business in many African countries. And the CCTV has been also very active in entering the North American market. And Steve mentioned that back in the 1980s, 1990s, there was only a handful foreign correspondents in China. Even today, I think there also a very small number of foreign journalists working in China, both because of the economic situation for many major American newspapers or broadcasting companies, but also the challenge, difficulties created by the Chinese government to maintain our numbers of foreign journalists in the country. But if you look at the number of Chinese journalists in the U.S., you would be surprised how many are there working in major American cities. So much so, the imbalance has been so big that last year, I think U.S. senators trying to introduce a law to limit the number of Chinese correspondents here in this country. But that's another question. China obviously is at the stage of bringing more Chinese media to the global stage.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that as well, I think that I did read reports that there was another radio station in California somewhere that was also being leased. But I also read that the radio station in Galveston the owners of it were not making money, no matter who they leased it to. And I think I did listen to it for once. And the only thing I can say about it is it reminds me of CCTV that use Chinese Central Television, everything news, and that you actually get a lot more world coverage than you would listening to American networks. But it does have a slant to it. It doesn't have a slant in the sense of it's necessarily pro-China. It just doesn't have anything that's critical of China. And it may have more things that are critical of America or other countries as well. But it's not so-called blatantly, critical in that sense. So, another question? Yes.
I'm interested in the bureaucracy around the media, but in general, what I think I hear you saying is the government bureaucracy has to grow and grow and grow because the people grow, the media grows. At one time, is it going to just fall over of its own weight? Is there practical limitations of what it can do, and would it slow down reform because it simply can't manage the volume?
I can tackle a little bit of that because that is more kind of what I study, is how the privatization of media in China. And if we look at the state media in China, you can see that in several periods, yes, it does grow very rapidly. But I think that anybody who looks at CCTV or China Daily Now and looks at these huge investments overseas knows that in a few years there's going to be huge cutting as well. So CCTV is very cyclical in its funding. And our own student, Eve Bauer, who worked for them, she came back to the U.S. to go to law school because they were cutting all of these shows. And then the current thing took off again.
But
and
if the censorship, would they cut that as well?
That remains to be seen whether they would actually cut that many censors. But it's also common in China that, for example, Zhu Rongji, the premier in 1998, said that we have far too many government officials, so let's cut half of them. And so let's get rid of half of them. But what that is it happens the same way as it kind of happened in the United States with NASA, for example. That NASA wanted to cut the number of workers who worked for NASA, so it offered early retirement to the older employees, who then retired and then were hired again as consultants at higher rates. And so that same thing happens in China. So I interviewed a lot of people who worked for the propaganda departments at local levels in the 90s, and they were told that there's too many of you, you have to retire. So they retired and they were picked up and worked for advertising companies, and then rehired basically by the government as consultants. So similar things happen.
And one thing that we're seeing right now as well is it's not that people are working exclusively as censors. So that's much more the case with old media, with print media, that a specific agent or a specific newspaper would have people who were there working as censors. But now, especially in the digital context, people who already are working at search engines like Baidu or at Sina Weibo have a kind of secondary role where they're actually censoring content as part of their role within the private company. So it's not necessarily as discrete as only government or only private sector. Sometimes there's overlap. So it's a hard question to answer because the roles can be shifting.
Okay, so my dad works in China Central Television.
Oh, great.
As in charge of censorship.
Okay.
And I can answer this question.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So for the bureaucracy of the China Central Television, there are actually like 3 types of hiring, like employees for working in China Central Television. Like for example, like the officials, like in charge of like programming or like censorship, like they are hired by the China Central Television as a state a state firm, but like they're also like the China Central Television also set up a company and just to to hire people for making to make films, to make like reports, news, these kind of things that like is out of the state.
So they do production, but not editorial.
Right. And also like there are kind of also just I would call it temporary workers that just work for the daily routine routine stuff like in there. So like there are in terms of just bureaucracy, there's not like so much bureaucracy. There's like affiliated a lot of like structures also.
They're taking advantage of outsourcing as well and privatization.
The effort to monitor what is being said on the internet, does the concern of the government extend to Chinese expats, expatriates, or people that live abroad? Are those people watched, or in a sense of what are they saying? Are the people that are paid to put pro-Chinese government comments, insert them into the discussion? Are they paid to insert themselves into discussions from overseas? Does it extend that far? Or is the concern local?
It's a very sharp observation and also a question not very easy to answer. To a certain extent, that answer is yes. The Chinese government is really very influential and also very influential among overseas Chinese communities. And I think Steve have already mentioned that, for instance, China Daily, right, have many local versions here in the U.S., in any major American cities, and also in Europe. And they also not only publish in English, but also in Chinese, targeting the transnational Chinese community. And a few years ago, there were quite a few independent Chinese news sites here in the U.S. But the rumors go that they have been now all bought out by major Chinese companies. So you can see the change in their coverage and in the tone of their editorial and news report.
Just as an addendum to that, so for example, U.S. Navy policy is that any officials who are staying, or any employees who are staying in 3-star hotels or above in China should consider the fact that their information, including their cell phone, their computer, has the potential to be examined or analyzed. So particularly in industries like are in Houston that are very strategic international industries like oil and gas, or tech industries, high-level officials there, particularly as it relates to cell phones or computers, should pay attention. But I mean, this is just a larger question. It's not just in China. These are larger questions of kind of, industrial and information hygiene and protocol that are the sorts of new questions that we're addressing globally as workforces and leadership move more broadly. But if you'd like to speak further at the end of the Q&A, I'd be happy to discuss it in greater detail.
That's another whole side to it as well, that this is serving a commercial purpose as well, that it might be, and this information might be handed over to Chinese state enterprises, who are engaged in negotiations and things like that. But also related to it, I can also point out that there are people who do survey research and consumer survey research in China because it's cheaper to hire people to do face-to-face interviews, which are viewed as being more reliable, but also because the local public security bureau will sell you the data on household income, names, works, and stuff like this, in a way that even the American government wouldn't do. Would actually sell you the data on all the people living in an area, so you can do very sophisticated consumer survey research in China that you can't do. And so, I mean, we see it very commonly. If you know people who go to China and they come back with all these flavors of, cookies and candy bars and things like this that you don't see in the United States. That's because they're all being tried in China because it's so much cheaper.
They're cookies on their computer.
Well, it could be cookies on their computer as well. There most certainly are. I think we have time for one last question. I think you had your hand up.
My name is Xiao, and I'm an international student from China. And my question is that there are more and more middle-class parents sending their kids to study abroad, and how do you think that would influence the reform of China? And also, I would like to make a little comment on the little story Dr. Koosh has just shared with us about the taxi driver. Because I heard that kind of story a lot from my former friends in China. And I think actually there are more and more people realize the problem of pollution now, and especially on the internet. People post the pollution rates in every city every day, and there are more and more people criticizing the problem of pollution. And I think the taxi driver says that on the one hand, it's probably because the government propaganda the pollution as false. On the other hand, it's probably because Chinese people can be very united in some way. And they can criticize their country and government by themselves. And once foreigners start to comment negatively, they become pretty defensive. So probably he knows it's pollution. He just wants to leave you a very good impression.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up.
I remember in 2008 when Beijing was holding the Olympic Games, and we watched on the newspapers that other countries were criticizing the pollution in Beijing. And we were all like, what? Beijing doesn't have any pollution. They just don't want us to hold the Olympic Games. So I think nowadays it's much better than what it used to be. And only when we start to realize the problem, we can start to find the ways to solve the problem.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really important point about the role of citizen journalism and citizen documentation of these environmental issues as it relates to both the circulation of the reporting of PM 2.5 and PM 10 levels, as well as youth activism as it relates to health and the environment, and not even just activism, but just concern about health issues and about creating a stable place for people to grow and develop. So I really appreciate you bringing up that point. And I think that, I'm from the Motor City, so I understand a lot about how people will, talk about the economic effects of really bad pollution in their communities. We had terrible water pollution where I was growing up, and it was something that we didn't discuss critically because it was part of our local industry. So I very much understand your perspective, and thank you for your point.
Also, my question. My first question.
Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, repeat the question, please.
My question is like, there are more and more middle-class parents sending their kids study abroad, and how does it influence the reform of China?
Yeah. I can answer this question.
Sure. We'll let our sociologist tackle this.
I think, like many other issues in China, you can look at these from many different perspectives. For instance, the National People's Congress just had its meeting in Beijing, and on Weibo there are many people commented that, hey, this is actually a Congress of the parent of Americans. Why? Because for many of the delegates, they already sent their children and their wife to the U.S. or other countries like Canada or Australia or other immigration countries, right? And there are also a lot of concerns why there are so many corrupted officials and why they don't even care about the environment in China because they don't have any stake in the country anymore. Their children will have a future in another country. Right, but I think this is just one part of the story. On the other hand, I feel like sending young people to the U.S. and other Western countries will only do good to China because it's opened their eyes, and I feel like you will be the future, not only for China but for the whole globe, because you know both cultures and you know both language, and you have an open mind, and you know what's going to be good for both China and for the world.
So the answer of all three professors is, how 学习.
Yeah.
Back to work and study for your exams. So for everybody else, thank you very much. And please join us for some refreshments outside where we can continue our discussions.
Nice, do that.